Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. And this session is going to really reflect a bit on where we ended up at the end of COP28, the things that are done, not done. It's been 8 years since Paris, which was my favorite COP, which was quite some time ago. We'll talk a bit about the status of Article 6. We have some amazing experts here on that. And also really looking at how, in the absence of having fully defined 6.2 and 6.4, how voluntary markets are evolving and some of the pre-compliance activities that are taking place. So welcome. We have a great panel. I'm just going to go in the order. They're sitting next to me. Lisa DeMarco from Resilient LLP, someone who I feel very fortunate to know. She's a lawyer, has provided a broad spectrum of legal support for financial institutions, everything from financial institutions to NGOs to indigenous people on transactions and different kinds of advisory activities to get to net zero. She's also on the AIDA Council that I'm on as well, so I get the opportunity to see her pretty regularly, and then has some great experience in negotiating. Next to her is Nathalie Flores, who's an advisor with a deep amount of experience and history working in UNFCCC on the market side of things, as well as supporting some of the AFLU greenhouse gas quantification. She's the vice chair as of 2023 for the Substep panel, and she's also done negotiation for DR, so welcome to you as well. And then at the very far end is Kim Myers from TNC, Senior Associate for Carbon Markets and Policy. And she's done some really important work and analysis on scaling and bringing high integrity VCM credits and done some analysis on Article 6, some of which is going to be coming out soon, right? So welcome to all of you and welcome to our panelists. The format will be, each of our panelists will have 2 to 3 minutes to kind of reflect on the area that they're interested in sharing, and then after that we'll do a Q&A with the panel, and then for those of you who have questions in the audience, we'll leave some time for those as well. So I think on the side of sort of the perspective from each of our panelists, let's start with Nathalie. I think you're taking the highest level approach, and so share with us what your thoughts are.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here. As you heard, this incredible woman are doing great work and have also a lot of experience in the negotiations, which tend to be like a difficult path to navigate. I always ask myself before talking about this is why people pay so much attention to the UN climate change negotiations. It's been 30 years since these negotiations were put in place after Rio Plus 20, which is where the 3 Rio conventions come from: biodiversity, desertification, and climate change. And it's always funny to me, I don't know if for them, that everybody talks about the COP and only refers to climate change. But each of these conventions have their conference of the parties. And the conference of the party turns out to be the biggest body of each convention, which means we put a president to lead the process, which is neutralized from the process because it's moderating the whole process. And the conference of the parties is the body in which ministers sit with that president to take the decisions. Under that, the convention has different bodies that leads other type of negotiations. I was explaining on Tuesday that in order to have a decision into place or a decision being decided, we need to go through this little crazy, if we want to call it that way, process in which parties and observers do submissions. Then we go through workshops, because that needs to be backed up by science before being a political text to be decided. And then after almost 2 years of expert meetings and review with scientists and with the whole community from NGOs to private sector to parties and everyone, then we have an agenda item. That agenda item needs to be negotiated in one of the 2 other bodies of the convention. So under the COP, we have the Science and Technology Body, which commonly is known as SAPSTA, that I have the honor to serve as vice chair. And we have the subsidiary body for implementation. So under SAPSTA, where the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is negotiated, we have all the decisions that needs scientific background to be a global decision. And that's what is negotiated under SAPSTA. And after SAPSTA, then decisions go to the subsidiary body for implementation. That is the decision that is going to allocate fund to a specific decision. So as I said the other day, even if it's to operationalize that each country has a gender action plan, to mention something, that needs finance. And each decision taken under the UN climate change needs to be mandated by the party, meaning that the UN climate change as secretariat doesn't have any autonomy to do something unless the parties ask for that in a decision. Even for me to be elected as vice chair, I had to go through a process in which all the parties needs to agree that I was going to be vice chair put forward by the small island developing states. And to close, this is important to understand because people is following up negotiations, but often they don't understand like what comes from the negotiations. So at the end, it's the legal framework that then is going to create policies in each country, because these decisions have the same level of the constitution of the country that ratifies either the convention, the Paris Agreement, or the Kyoto Protocol.
Great, that's wonderful, and in fact, super helpful for me. Even I've been in the market for a really long time, I didn't know all that, so thank you. Lisa, why don't we turn to you and maybe drill down a little bit more on Article 6 and then other observations you had from COP28.
Yeah, let me try and condense into 3 minutes the three main contact points where Article 6 hits most of you in the room. The first is in relation to, which is not exactly Article 6, but it's incorporated into Article 6, the CDM. There are historical credits under the CDM that were permitted into the Article 6 world, particularly permitted into the realm of international transferred mitigation outcomes, and that happened in Glasgow. And it was assumed that this was a quantity of about 60,000 certified emission reductions. Looks a lot more like about 800,000 right now. So there is controversy around the environmental impact of that, the procedures around that, the timing of that. And there are market participants who acted on the basis of the Glasgow decisions and are waiting for the clarity to come through the process. We didn't get that. We didn't get the prescriptive detail. Okay, how do we make this happen? When does it happen? What forms do I need to submit? How do I get it out of a registry? What happens here and there? So we're waiting on some of those details. The second is in relation to Article 6.4. So this is the second of the three contact points. And that is a top-down mechanism governed by a supervisory body that provides for a crediting mechanism that may include private sector members. And we had two main developments that were developed by that supervisory body. One was the incorporation of certain methodologies, so an approach to including existing methodologies, and the second was an approach to removals. And we didn't get agreement on approval of those two elements. And the third contact point for you is Article 6.2. It is up and running. And I'll get to some stats later, but it is up and running. The reporting and tracking forms, to nail it down, were the subject of this negotiation. We already have a draft form. The agreed electronic format, that's the AEF, for those of you who actually need another acronym in your daily quota, has been in draft since Sharm el-Sheikh, and this COP was supposed to make that draft final. We did not get agreement. on this point. I'm going to finish with why. There were some philosophical divisions that I spoke to this morning, quite bluntly, that I won't be as blunt about this afternoon, but really there are concerns between the EU and certain rainforest nations around the process and the environmental integrity and the politics around Article 5 and Article 6. So those were impediments to getting agreement in 3 minutes or less, hopefully.
That was great. Thank you. That's more color. And now, Kim, just turning to sort of the connection between what we've seen under, Article 6, under COP, under UNFCCC, and how you're seeing some of those things work into the voluntary market and voluntary actions, maybe even under Article 6.2 and other things.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Leslie for moderating today, and I'm really honored to be on a panel of very capable and smart women, all women panel today, so go women. I'll admit that my role in carbon markets policy is really focused around the voluntary carbon market, so a lot of the thinking the TNC has been doing around this is thinking about what Article 6 will do to impact that. And part of the way that we've been tracking that is to try to understand what countries have started doing outside of Article 6 negotiations. So I'm sure a lot of you are aware COP28 was a bit of a disappointment around Article 6. We didn't get any final text agreed to. But nonetheless, we did see a lot of movement from countries around their eagerness to start to implement 6.2, which is that more flexible framework that doesn't require as much UNFCCC negotiation at this point. So we're starting to see, we saw our first actual transaction of Article 6 credits between Switzerland and Thailand, which was really exciting. We've seen a few authorizations happen. Again, Switzerland is driving a lot of this movement here, but Peru is one example of a country that has been starting to authorize, Ghana. But another area that is really interesting that's starting to come out and give us a better idea of how Article 6 will scale and impact the VCM is these carbon market frameworks. And we've been researching around 8 different countries that have actually implemented regulations around Article 6 and carbon markets more generally. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more. But zooming in specifically to the VCM, there's still a lot of lack of clarity around what Article 6 will do to the market in terms of supply, in terms of demand. But nonetheless, we're starting to understand the ways in which voluntary projects are maybe co-regulated under Article 6, under the Article 6 market with these carbon market frameworks, the ways in which Article 6 might lean on voluntary methodologies. And so I can talk about that as well a bit more. I think it's an interesting topic that we'll dive into.
Great, thank you for that. So when we were talking about how we might share some of the reflections and experiences, one of the things that we thought about is it's always great to get examples of what we're seeing out there and how things are evolving and how countries are taking approaches, whether they're on the buyer side of things or the seller side of things. And Nathalie, you know, with your experience in the Dominican Republic, you had said that they've really started to do some bilateral transactions, and maybe you could share a bit about that. And then I wanted to add a little bit to that and how you might see that leverage into AFLU at some point in the future.
Good. Well, for those who doesn't know, I was I'm former climate change director of the Dominican Republic, which I had the honor to serve for the past 3 years. And when I was at the Ministry of Environment, under that role, we managed to put together 2 bilateral agreements. So we did one bilateral agreement with the Swedish government, specifically with the Swedish Energy Agency, and another one with the Ministry of Trade of Singapore that is actually leading the way on bilateral agreements when it comes to Asia. It was a long process because this is new to all of us, and both countries, both the seller and the buyer or the investor is still figuring out how these bilateral agreements are going to work. And you need to involve everyone. You need to involve foreign affairs, you need to involve trade, investment, or whoever has the constituency to give the go on what you develop over there when the credit is going to be issued, and the whole concept of corresponding adjustment and all this thing. So right now, these bilateral agreements are being put into place in terms of the operationalization, because these are memorandums of understanding, but in order to trade carbon, you need to go to both of the legal framework of these countries. Starting from the Constitution, for example, for the Dominicans is a duty and a right to develop to climate change with focus on adaptation. And that's why then the national determined contribution of the Dominican Republic has a very big component on investment for adaptation. Of course, we are a very small island developing states. We are in the middle of the Caribbean. We have 6 months of hurricanes. We live from tourism, and all of this plays a role when we need investment in nature conservation. And of course, living from the tourism, you cannot live from tourism without nature, which is funny because usually the tourism sector and the environment in the Dominican Republic look different ways. Like one looks for the profit and the other one looks for conservation. So right now, even though I'm not in the government, of course, I love my country and I'm super happy that I can advise them. And what the country is trying to put into place with support of the Global Growth Institute with funding from Sweden is trying to put into place this carbon market implementation approach that it has a specific name. So the idea is to work in between both countries and the agencies that need to be involved and do a traceability process in order to investors to actually do the projects. With Sweden, it's focused on energy. So we have different institutions that oversees energy in the Dominican Republic, but the final authorization from the NDA will come from a specific institution that are into place by a decree. But the project development, it's going to be in between the Ministry of Energy or the Energy Commission or everything energy that we have in the Dominican Republic. And with Singapore, then it's more focused on the quota that the country has to abate their mitigation goals, the goals of the country. And where I left the conversation, because right now, I keep my distance, but where I left the conversation was in trying to invest in projects that the country haven't done before. So like climate smart agriculture, going forward to transform the way in which agriculture survives with nature, because the president has been clear that we cannot compromise food security, yet we need water. We don't have enough snowpack, so we have to protect the forest. So the idea is to, since our biggest emissions come from energy and transportation, the idea is to look into energy, transportation, trade, and of course, trade when it comes to fossil fuels, right? And also, agriculture, as I said before, yeah. Because the country has little investment in decarbonize that area. So I think I can leave it over there, and we keep the conversation.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, when did you start that process? How many years ago?
Okay, so so before Glasgow, we were working during the pandemic. I joined the government at the end of 2020, and we started the conversation like 6 months before Glasgow, and then we spent about a year and a half, with each government. So 1 year and a half with Sweden and 1 year and a half with Singapore. Yeah.
Well, trailblazing takes time.
Even in COP27 in Egypt, we did a whole stage to practice the signature of the MOU, and we couldn't sign it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And it's also so interesting to hear that example and how specific it is to the Dominican Republic, right? Where, like you said, ecotourism, but also coffee, cacao, huge part of the GDP there, and how important that adaptation piece is. So thanks for sharing that. And hopefully they keep at it and finish up. Lisa, you have also worked on some 6.2 types of transactions and advised both sides, I think, of countries and so forth, and maybe you can share some of your examples on them.
Yeah, to put it in very pragmatic terms, there are a couple of key elements that you need to really get these done. And one is the International Framework Agreement, which looks like a bilateral agreement between countries. And you can call it various different things. Some countries call it a memorandum of understanding, depending on the constitutional construct that they're operating in. Others call it an IFIA, or International Framework Agreement. And then there's the corresponding elements that are required by each country. And they take the form of letters of authorization and related authorizations to get that done. And there are specific elements that you want to see in those letters of authorizations. And one of the most difficult elements is knowing the most basic thing that you could possibly imagine. And that is, who are the parties to that letter of authorization? Are you dealing with the right arm of government? Do you have the requisite authority or party that can grant you the authority that you need? So I would say a lot of the hard legwork is making sure you're dealing with the right entity, and the legal documentation that comes down around that happens. Then there's the associated accounting mechanism. Often that's a schedule to the International Framework Agreement, or it can be done in the agreement itself. But manifesting that associated accounting and reporting and tracking into the process that Nathalie outlined so well is super important. There's a format that it has to be done in. Right now it's a draft format under Article 6, but the more that we have entities reporting under this same format, and the more that that pattern and practice is recognized, it becomes international law. So international law is formed on the basis of pattern and practice. And if there's external recognition of that pattern and practice, you can safely say this is international law at this point. So looking at the agreed electronic format, the annual information form that parties submit, the biennial transparency report, assuming you're dealing with two parties, and the first biennial transparency report after the end of the compliance period are the touch points with the transaction into the procedure that allows for it to be called a compliance unit. We have one transaction that now has that status, and that is the Guyana transaction recently undertaken through the American Carbon Registry and Art Trees. And that has happened with a corresponding adjustment, the associated requirements to pull what happened through the Paris process with those reporting touch points. So very important. We hope to see many, many more. And I just want to dispel one myth, if I can.
Dispel or smell?
Dispel. Dispel with tea in your mouth. There you go. There's a theory, a thought, that Article 6 is dead, and I just pulled a few stats for you. Since the COP, since Dubai, we have had 13 new bilateral agreements. So we're talking a period of now 3 months. 1 new buyer, Norway. 4 new host countries, developing countries that need capital to achieve their energy transition. 2 new pilot projects. 1 new authorization statement. And most importantly, last but not least, the first effective issuance of Article 6.2 correspondingly adjusted ITMOs, 1,916 of them.
Start
So
somewhere.
it's not dead.
That's great, thanks.
It's not dead, it's coming.
That's fantastic. Just kind of also picking up on the comment of who the heck is supposed to sign all this stuff. And we've certainly found that in our work. But that brings us back to what you're seeing, Kim, in countries that are starting to bring on, domestic carbon-related, laws and procedures and policies. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and some of the work that you've seen, you've been doing, that would let us understand, because ultimately when that happens, hopefully there's clarity on who has to sign what, right?
Yeah, hopefully so. And I would say some countries are doing that, clarifying that a little bit better than others. But we do have some indications there of the trends that will emerge. Nathalie and Lisa talked a bit about the bilateral agreements that are emerging, authorizations and transactions. Those are all really exciting. And I'll leave it to them they had great words on those developments. But another interesting thing, I mentioned this in my opening statement, is these regulatory frameworks that are putting into law for a lot of seller countries how they're going to be executing and implementing 6.2 domestically. So actually, the Nature Conservancy, we've been doing research in the past few months around 8 different regulatory frameworks that have emerged in the past couple of years to regulate Article 6. They also kind of join together with the other carbon markets, so it includes the voluntary carbon market and compliance markets in some cases. So there's 8 of these, and at a high level, they're defining the who, the how, and the what around Article 6 trades. So as Leslie was asking, the who is, who has the authority within the country to issue an authorization? Who's going to be managing the national registry? Who's going to be reporting up to the UNFCCC? So these things get defined in those frameworks. The how also gets included in these frameworks. So around which projects or which markets need to be registering under these national registries. How can they go about finding who in the government and the process by which they go onto these registries and how to seek an authorization. So all of these things mentioned earlier, again, put into text and clearly defined out in a process, which is very helpful for us to understand how Article 6 is going to move forward. But also, I think one of the most interesting pieces that's in these frameworks is the what. And by what, I mean what credits are actually going to be authorized for trade under Article 6, which credits are going to be authorized for corresponding adjustments. So I'll say a little bit about that. A few different models have emerged from countries. They don't all have the same format for their NDC. So when they're thinking about which credits to sell that won't be used towards their NDC, they're thinking about this in a few different ways. For example, Rwanda and Ghana have stated that they will only sell credits that come out of their conditional NDC. So this is national climate targets that require external finance to be achieved. So they'll sell correspondingly adjusted credits from sectors within that target. On the other hand, we have Indonesia and Paraguay who are saying, okay, we are going to take a percentage of Article 6 credits that get traded internationally and save them to meet our NDC. So that's kind of how they're hedging and making sure that they are achieving their climate goals domestically. And another interesting approach that we've seen so far only with Zambia, but I think it's a smart approach because it ensures that the seller country, is keeping the most cost-effective mitigation activities for themselves to meet their own NDC. They don't have to pay. They can kind of sell away the higher cost mitigations to these buyer countries that can probably afford to pay more. So in Zambia, they'll only be authorizing credits for sale that meet a certain cost threshold. So the mitigation activity cost is the main determinant of whether or not a credit gets authorized. So those are just a few things that are starting to emerge in terms of trends around these carbon market frameworks and will give us a sense into how the market is going to scale.
Wow, that's fascinating. Although I have to, thinking about what Zambia is trying to do, at least in the AFLU sector, You think about red credits, they come pretty quickly, they tend to be fairly cost-effective, but so many landscapes also need tree planting, whether it's for conservation, food crops, high-value crops, wood energy, and they cost more, and they take a lot longer for those credits to come. So you might think a strategy would be exactly the opposite, is if you take your credits that you can get early on that are more cost-effective, sell them for 4, 5, 6 times what it costs to produce them, and then take that money and plow that back into the things that are more expensive. And so it is interesting to see varying opinions and approaches. And I didn't know that about Zambia, which is pretty bad, given the fact we're considering an investment there. So, Lisa, did you want to say something
Yeah,
on that?
let me just do a
Yeah.
little Canadian-American or Canadian UN translation. You're saying AFLU, and the Canadian or the UN speak is AFOLU. So I think we're talking about agriculture, forestry, and other land use.
Yeah, and I was
Yeah.
specific talking
Yeah.
about avoided deforestation with any kind of ARR tree planting, regardless of the use, as just one example of how you might want to do the exact opposite of what Zambia is doing. Because, especially also because of the timing of the credits that come from ARR. It just takes a really long time, but cool. Well, that's the paper that's coming out?
That's the paper. Keep an eye out, probably in the next month or two. It'll be Lessons Across Latitudes. So we'll put it up on LinkedIn.
Oh, that sounds fabulous. Sounds fabulous. Lisa, did you want to share anything more specific about any country 6.2, or maybe even a little more insight into 6.4, even though we had a model that's kind of 6.4-ish? Like, do you, either of those things, you want to share a bit more about those?
Yeah, so we've recently put out a paper with the Public Policy Forum dispelling myths. It's in the Canadian context, but these myths are widely held. And let me just say it bluntly, simply exporting lower carbon intensity fossil fuel does not constitute an Article 6 credit. So in the Canadian context, that translates to simply exporting liquefied natural gas does not in and of itself constitute an Article 6 credit. There is the possibility to include natural gas as an energy transition jurisdictional strategy to lower the carbon intensity writ large of a jurisdiction while ensuring affordability, while ensuring electricity reliability feasible. But that overarching accounting approach is critical. That's myth number 1. Myth number 2 is that activities that are undertaken around methane don't qualify. Methane is a really important strategy, and methane recovery or methane destruction and capture and or control of methane emissions is incredibly important and shouldn't be overlooked. It's very potent natural gas. It's a global warming potential of 25. For every 1 molecule of methane that you reduce, you get at least 25 CO2 equivalents for that action. And it has a big bang for the buck when we're talking about the atmosphere's carrying capacity. So that's another element. And then last but not least, if we're really serious about talking about energy transition, facilitated coupling or coupled strategies where you're looking at nature-based solutions in the context of industrial transformation and providing some certainty to the industrials or the private sector in the form of, if you invest in this, you're not going to get a greenwashing complaint, is really darn important. So whether we do that through the UN process or through domestic processes is pretty critical. So 6.2, these are predominantly 6.2 concerns. 6.4, we need to get that up and running as soon as we can. And if we don't, we fully expect to see migration of what would have been under 6.4 into 6.2. So if you're not going to do it plurilaterally through the United Nations process, so be it. It'll get done bilaterally or through a group of like-minded countries through the Article 6.2 process. It would be tragic, given what we went through in Paris and afterwards, if that were to be the case. But the private sector will act regardless. And I think your voices, this is where we'll do a call out here, are really, really important. There is the potential for public input into that UN process. And as I said earlier this morning, if you're going to complain, you can't do it validly unless you've submitted comments. So get your voice heard, get your comments into that process. They close at
On April 15th. So you have until April 15th to do to provide your inputs.
And is this specifically related to Article 6, Article 6.4, or?
It's for the requirements for methodologies on activities involving removals. So you have the two reports of the supervisory body of Article 6 and 6.4. So this is basically what was not an agreement at COP. And countries are keen to have a decision at COP29, which I'm hopeful we should be, but this is the process to follow in order to have an agreement by the end of the year. So this was like the little thing that broke everything at COP28. So this is what we need to fix, and that's why the call for inputs from the decision is open right now. So get involved and do what you have to do.
These are all
Just-
sorts of removals, you guys?
I was just going to say, just to be clear, this is not just nature-based removals. This also applies to negative emissions technology-based removals. And getting private sector informed views into that process is incredibly important. It will help stop some of the misperspectives and some of the non-facts that have been challenging the process.
Great. So Natalie, you had raised a question here that I wasn't aware of, because I'm not in the same zone as you are. It says, why are nationally determined contributions now referred to as national climate plans, and how do they play an important role on Article 6 under the Paris Agreement, and what's your take on countries to present more ambitious strategies by early 2025?
Well, national determined contribution are the decarbonization strategies that are going to actually make the corresponding adjustment happen. So it's the commitment that the country has. Because the UN Climate Change Convention has an article that establishes the principle of differentiated commitments. So before, like under the convention, small countries that didn't cause climate change didn't have the same decarbonization commitment as the developed countries. But under the Paris Agreement, all the parties agreed on having the same level of commitment, and that is established under their national determined contribution. So the first strategy that countries presented was an intention of decarbonization. And then the second strategy was being more ambitious with an actual target of decarbonization of their economies at different levels. And that's where the numbers come, like conditional, private sector, public sector, international cooperation to actually meet this strategy, because at the end, we all have the same goal of reducing our emissions, but depending on the condition that you put in that strategy is where you have the investment of the projects. So now, under the decisions and the discussions of NDCs, countries need to present a more ambitious NDC by the end of 2024, meaning that each country needs a new NDC presented to the convention by December 2024 or the first week of January of 2025. So at this specific moment, the NDC partnership, which is the institution that regulates how the funds for countries to meet the part of the international cooperation of their NDC and fixing this decarbonization strategy that they need to present to the convention, is a commitment as the reports that Lisa was mentioning. So countries need to report national communication, BTRs, and all these reports that it's with their GHG inventory, but also like this strategy. So now countries are working on that. And that means that their target could change. So if you are going to invest in a specific country, maybe that country is going to open a bigger door for you to invest, because if they are more ambitious, that means that they need to reduce more, or that the other country needs to reduce more. And the investment on these mitigation actions will flow around what they commit in this new climate plans, as the UN Executive Secretary Simon has been referring to. So now Simon is calling it NDC 3.0, and he's saying Climate Action Plan, which for me sells better than NDC. Like at the end in the climate work, everybody talks in acronyms, and we get lost in our acronyms. So that's important of looking into that, because countries have to do public calls to involve the private sector in the establishment of these strategies. They have to do calls with scientists. They have to do call within the public sector, and even the international community performing in their countries, and that is gonna produce that new strategy. So yeah.
Great. Well, for countries to basically be able to meet those, what are hopefully, more, aspirational commitments, they're going to need finance, right? And it's sort of back to you, Kim. I've got a question. As Terra Global, we run an investment fund focused on nature, and we're trying to provide private sector investment to projects on the ground, and that is primarily was set up for voluntary purposes, where corporates would not use them in any compliance obligation. And so one of the big questions that we have as we figure out where we're going to put money, which countries, are we going to have to get a corresponding adjustment, is whether or not the voluntary use is going to require a corresponding adjustment in the future. And I know that wasn't on our list of questions, but I thought with your expertise, you might have some thoughts on that question, because that will change a lot if the answer is yes versus no, and maybe we don't know the answer.
Yeah. It's a very graceful pivot between NDCs and the voluntary carbon market, because they certainly overlap, but maybe not in very obvious ways. I want to pick up one thing really quick, maybe not directly related to your question, Leslie, around the voluntary carbon market within these carbon market frameworks. They are starting to get implemented under seller country regulations. And sometimes it does involve a corresponding adjustment, and sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on the country. I would say on the whole, the general trend is that voluntary carbon projects or credits that are going to be sold on the voluntary carbon market do need to at least be registered on a national registry within these frameworks. Yeah, but then in terms of corresponding adjustments, there are at least a few countries that are explicitly saying, we have the Bahamas, we have Indonesia, saying that voluntary carbon credits do need a corresponding adjustment in addition to Article 6 credits. So the question of whether or not we're going to see that in the voluntary carbon market, it will depend where the credit is based. But from a buyer perspective, voluntary buyers on the market might also be looking for correspondingly adjusted credits as a measure of, reputational enhancement, saying like we have these higher quality credits, or we have credits that maybe have safer guards against political risk. So some voluntary buyers have come forward and said that they do want to purchase correspondingly adjusted credits. I wouldn't say that's the norm yet, But what we're seeing in terms of signals from the general carbon markets, the industry standards like the registries, the quality initiatives, and the alphabet soup. That's our new term for VCM-I and ICVCM. CCPs, all of the fun letters. UNFCCC likes to use those too. Really haven't taken a strong stance on this. I think they're holding back. They're waiting for more guidance from the Article 6 negotiations, waiting to see what countries want to do, waiting to see how this will affect supply. So there's not a strong indicator yet, I think, for a lot of the voluntary buyers to purchase corresponding adjusted credits. And so they're kind of in the minority now. And I don't really expect that to change this year. But obviously, things are moving quickly now, so we'll see how things develop in 2025.
Lisa, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, let me just jump in. In terms of Glasgow and then following Sharm el-Sheikh, we had two main categories of, I'm going to call them verified credits, because it's not fully voluntary, right? There are rules, there are requirements, there are structures. One is a series that are authorized for use, and we can break that category down into authorized for use towards an NDC, authorized for use for other international mitigation purposes, and that would include CORSIA. The second category is Article 6.4 emission reductions that are not authorized for use. We would call that legally exempt from authorization. And in fact, that's the best, most secure way you can proceed if you have a clear exemption. If you think you're doing a voluntary carbon credit project and you don't have clear authorization, you are living with a contingent liability. You are living with the possibility that a country at any moment in time could say, I think those need to be authorized. Or I think, as it's happened in Indonesia, in Madagascar, in PNG, in other countries, there's a moratorium on anything coming out of my country. This is a natural resource, and I haven't authorized it. I haven't exempted it. So from that perspective, I would be very careful in not having any relative direction from the country in question as to the authorization status or the exemption status. As I say, there is a category under 6.4 that allows for non-authorized credits to not require a corresponding adjustment. Anything that is authorized does require a corresponding adjustment under the combination of Sharm el-Sheikh and Glasgow, the two decisions there. So
Thanks for that. Now I'm going to go back and take all these things out of our pipeline. No, I think it's.
Get those exemptions.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge. Sometimes a government's not ready enough to even provide those, which is where maybe political risk insurance comes in, which we're looking at. So, great. Well, we only have about 10 minutes, and we wanted to open it up to see if there were any questions in the audience that you would have for our panel members here. Anybody have any questions? Come on, you got to have at least a question. You got all these smart women up here with all kinds of experience. Yeah.
Matt Evans from Environmental Commodity Partners. Lisa, you mentioned the correspondingly adjusted units from Guyana. What is the framework in place through which those corresponding adjustments actually happen at this point? Are they sort of sovereign obligated future corresponding adjustments, or are they correspondingly adjusted?
The final moment to say they are correspondingly adjusted, definitive, is the first biennial transparency report after the first compliance period. That's when we say signed, sealed, delivered, done, absolutely, there's no but. Once they're annually reported or reported through the agreed electronic format or the annual information form, it's basically fraud to not have them carried through. So I'd say you're 99.9% of the way there once you've got an agreed electronic format report, plus the annual information form being reported, so you're actually tracking it through the system. You'd have to have them unreport, and the international community would be all over that, right? It's just not feasible. So I would want to see the first touch point being the AEF and the AIF, specifically the AEF, to say they're correspondingly adjusted for all intents and purposes. I'd say your contingent liability goes from an asset pretty much at that point.
Those units in Ghana, they've received that?
Repeat the question. They've got the intention and the associated indication that they will be reporting through the AEF and the AIF. And so it's the first one that's gone through that process and said, we will be doing this at the appropriate times in this year.
I think this is it was a great question, but it also shows how important, when you're doing a transaction, getting the right legal support that understands these details. And again, I'm not trying to sell your services, but those are the kinds of things that have to be in an agreement and in a very specific way, and it's a very detailed process with acronyms that are all brand new to me, so here's your woman. Other questions from the audience? After 2 3/4 days talking about, what has happened that's good, what's not so good, any other questions? Got another one right over here. Thank you.
Nathalie, you were in a panel earlier with a woman from Panama, and she was mentioning that they needed a lot more data to be able to kind of figure out what they could sell. And you just said recently in this panel that, once the company or countries' like goals kind of elevate, they can start trading more. I'm wondering if you guys have any ideas of like how you anticipate that tug and pull between countries kind of protecting what they can trade at first and then kind of ramping that up as they increase their ambitions. If that makes sense.
Well, each country is different, and this is probably the most challenging part of the multilateral process, that each country has, its own problem, correct? So coming to the multilateral side of things, to have regulation for everyone is super challenging. But in a specific case of Panama and most developing countries that are looking for that funding to actually develop whatever scheme related to the UN climate change, they should rely on the accountability of the reports that Lisa was referring to. So at the end, everything is connected, right? So countries report the national communication, as I said before. They report the biannual report. Then they have the enhanced transparency framework that it's also another report. The NDC tracking. Developing countries trade a lot in order to have all of this in an international decision, but that's the only way they can get funding from developed countries to actually have a global decision on this issue. And why I mentioned those reports, because the science of what they emit or they reduce, it should be reported in those, all of these reports that are actually public on the webpage of the UN climate change. So each tracking that the country does under the reporting, even for REP+, for example, there is the REP+ hub, where all the reference level of the countries are reviewed by a peer reviewer that needs to even pass a test to be able to review a specific report of a country. So the data in which these countries needs to rely on needs to be accountable in those reporting that I'm mentioning, that at the end are GHG inventories report. So Panama, in terms of forest, is negative. So they don't emit from forest, and that needs to be reliable under all this reporting, and that's the data. But that's not a specific case. And also, Panama has been open to the voluntary carbon market, and they have a memorandum of understanding with different standards that are out there. I don't want to refer any specific standard, but that are out there. They have memorandum of understanding to actually use those standards for what they are putting together in their national system. So is Chile, so is the subnational state of Querétaro in Mexico. So countries are, looking into everything, but the most important thing is that the compromise with the UN Climate Change Convention as a treaty and with the parties agreement, it's honoring the NDC and the reporting around the NDC.
Great, thanks, Natalie. I just wanted to call things. Are there any other questions before we close the panel? Oh, great, one other one, thanks.
Deirdre McEntee with ConocoPhillips. I just have an aspirational question because I find the VCM market and the Article 6 market and each country's compliance markets very confusing. What's your hope that there's going to be convergence of all those three markets?
Who wants to take that first, Lisa?
Yeah, I think we're seeing convergence. And in fact, right now, when we draft contracts, we often draft them as convertibles, contingent on the process. And that's why I like to call it the verified carbon market. It's quite feasible. In particular, as we go through time, you'll see innovation happening in the verified carbon market and going into the Paris compliance market once it becomes less twinkle in the eye innovative. And national domestic markets like the EU ETS, like the Canadian system, like any number of the nationally regulated carbon pricing systems should, in my view, will need to allow Article 6 units into their compliance regimes if they're going to meet their related NDC targets. Otherwise, the affordability becomes increasingly problematic, and the electorate doesn't like unaffordable, basic needs, commodities, energy, food, etc. So I think it really does, the whole beauty of Article 6 is to increase the affordability of energy transition and to do so more rapidly. Let's get there quicker. Let's make meaningful progress in this decade, i.e. in the next 5 years. We're now 5 years into the critical decade, and only 5 years away from that 2030 target. And let's do it in a way that is affordable for ultimately the end-use customers who are feeling the pressure of overarching transition costs.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I would just add on, in terms of the voluntary carbon market in Article 6, I think they learn, they're taking notes from each other, and Article 6 has already started to consider, or there's speculation that they'll be using some of the methodologies that have been developed under the voluntary carbon market in Article 6 trades. So under 6.2, the buyer and seller country ultimately decide what the standard of quality is for the units. Singapore has already published a white list of pre-approved methodologies that are from the VCM that they'll be using to purchase credits. Other countries like Japan are kind of making their own kind of bespoke methodologies from country to country. So it's not a definite, necessarily a universal thing. But the same could be true for 6.4. We don't know which methodologies they'll be using yet. We'll assume mostly it'll be adapted from CDM, but they might also bring in some voluntary methodologies depending on how the negotiations shake out. And I think that's a great thing. We need more alignment around quality of credits. So if we see more common methodologies used amongst both those markets, it's a positive sign.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the question. And I just want to, on behalf of the panelists, thank the Climate Action Reserve for having us for this panel. I think it's been a really great discussion around sort of the status of Article 6 and the intersection between Article 6 and voluntary, or what I'm going to start calling verified carbon markets, because I think pretty soon there will be one difference potentially, which is the corresponding adjustment, right? And hopefully we can get there fast enough. And I really want to thank the amazing panel. Lisa, Natalie, and Kim, thank you so much for your time, and thank all of you for being here today.
Thanks, Leslie. Thank you.